Well, welcome back to Voice for Freedom podcast, a podcast of Arise, where we discuss Israel and freedom and the nexus between those two things. I'm here today with Calev Myers, my esteemed brother, co-founder and chairman of Arise, and of course, my beautiful wife, Simone. My name is Simeon Myers, for those that don't know. I am Calev's security double, so when we travel together, I try to stay in close proximity to Calev so that people can kind of direct the bullets my way.
It's funny you say that, by the way. I got a WhatsApp text from a friend who apparently just saw today our latest podcast on YouTube. And he said, I saw this email from you and was greatly impressed by the beard. So I tuned in to watch, thinking to myself, there's something different about Calev, only to find out it was your brother. So we get that sometimes.
Much less impressive in general, but a decent beard. Anyway, for those of you that have been tracking with us a little bit, we're very, very honored to have such distinguished guests that are relationships and friendships that we've been able to build over the years through the work that we do. Every so many episodes, every 3 or 4 episodes, it's our intention, Calev and I, to do a debrief where we sort of go over the content that was covered in the previous episodes and just discuss it, maybe give our take on it, potentially do a little bit of a deeper dive. So that's what the episode is today. We've got Simone, our producer, and also my beautiful wife, with us today to help guide us through that process. So Simone, I'm just going to let you sort of take us into it.
All right. So our first episode we had on Dr. Dan Diker. We talked about Iran and its proxies. And in this first clip, I'm going to play, he talked about his take on the war and basically his solution to it all.
And we figured that if we could defeat Palestinian terror, and ultimately, even today, look at Yahya Sinwar, former head of Hamas, as was Hassan Nasrallah of Hezbollah, of Iranian Hezbollah, as well as Ismail Haniyeh, who is one of the external leaders of the Hamas. It's not enough to assassinate. You have to de-radicalize and re-educate. That's the war we're in. It's I think, far more dangerous and consequential than just the military or counterterror war, because people live and die by perceptions, feelings, ideas.
Yeah, I love what Dan's saying here. I think that he's right. I think it's important to point out that Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005, pretty much exactly 18 years before we were attacked on October 7th, 2023. 18 years is the exact amount of time it would have taken for somebody to be born, educated, and, ready to go start life. I think it's relevant to point out that some of the people who came across the fence on October 7th, they're 16, 17, 18-year-olds. And they grew up on a diet of hate, of hatred and anti-Semitism. It all could be very different. And we can talk about, the possibilities of actually changing that. I think we do have a window of opportunity now that UNRWA is out of the picture. UNRWA was a Hamas-controlled UN organization that educated this whole generation of violence. There is a scripture that I've mentioned once or twice. I'm not sure if in the framework of one of these podcasts, but a very interesting chapter of the Bible, Zechariah chapter 9, which is the only place in all the Hebrew scriptures that predicts a war with Lebanon, the Gaza Strip, and Yemen at the same time. The cities mentioned there, which I'm saying are the Gaza Strip, or Ashdod, Ashkelon, Ekron, and Gaza, which are all in that same area. It's interesting to note that they're all mentioned in the same chapter. And in the chapter is actually a verse that says, and I think it's verse 11 of Zechariah, and I will send back to you your prisoners from a pit with no water, which sounds to me like the hostages in the tunnel. It's very interesting when you read these prophecies, and they can add hope to a situation 2,500 years after they were given. But I think it's around verse 7 or 8 in that chapter. It talks about the people of Gaza being like a bastard, that their king will be removed, that he'll perish. And it says they'll be like a bastard, like a people without a leader, without a father. And it says that I will remove the blood and abomination from between their teeth. And I thought to myself, what's the blood and abomination in their teeth? It's like the whole education system, which is like an abomination. It's education to hatred and anti-Semitism and jihad, that will be removed. And to the extent that eventually Gaza will be as like a tribe as like Judah. In other words, I see that if, Lord willing, that prophecy does relate to today, and we can look to it for hope and say, wait a second, maybe there will be a reform in the Gaza Strip. Maybe a different generation will come up, and a people that actually want to live in peace and coexistence with their Jewish neighbors, like most Israelis on this side of the border have been educated and want to do.
So first of all, let it be as you have spoken. And as the scriptures say, that the hostages will be returned. You and I have invested quite a bit of time in trying to help that process. And we know that that's front and foremost for all Israelis and hopefully for all of the Jews around the planet. Secondly, I think this is a really interesting topic. And I think to me, it leads to even some bigger picture topics. I think I like the way that Dan is looking at this in his response to the question and saying there's a much bigger picture here. It's not just this war that's taking place right now, but there's a whole backstory to all of this. And I think that's so crucial for people around the world to understand as they're observing and hearing all of these narratives about what's taking place right now on the ground. And I would say behind all of it, I have the wonderful opportunity, if you would, to sit and process and watch all of the various voices that are sounding off across social and mainstream media. It seems to be lost on a lot of the voices in the space right now that, first of all, the historicity of all of this, but also the fact that Israel really doesn't have a peace partner. I'd be curious your take on that, Calev. That's my take. We don't have a peace partner. That should really provide, at this point, a backdrop for understanding this entire situation when Israel's in a very, very difficult position perpetually and indefinitely, where the nations of the world came together, essentially in 1948 and the years leading up to that, and agreed on the Jews' right to self-determination in their ancestral homeland. And they agreed on what that was and put steps in place to make that happen. And that became a reality. And a nation was born in a day, as we know, the only nation in history that's come back after 3,000 years to the same location on the map, using the same currency and speaking the same language. Unprecedented and truly the greatest story of decolonization that's ever happened around the world. And that doesn't undermine the plight of people that were existing and living in that region at the time. But it is important to understand that there was an offer on the table at that time for this people to have their own land. And some people agreed to that and some didn't. And the ones that agreed are what we understand today and call today Arab Israelis, right? They may call themselves Palestinians, but they have all the rights of Israelis, and there are different levels to the rights and ID cards and all those different things that you hear a lot of chatter about. But people don't understand that the other group rejected this and has rejected every offer since then. And there have been many. And they reject the notion of peaceful coexistence and are committed to jihad. They are committed to intifada. They are committed to violently overthrowing and pushing, all of the Jews out of Israel. And as long as that is the case, what's the solution? As long as that's the leadership and they say it openly, then what options does Israel really have other than to continually be addressing this violent threat?
Yeah, it's a difficult situation. I think that's a valid analysis of what we see today. Many people say, well, Hamas are the radical religious fundamentalists. jihad is their way, and they've said we will officially. They said we'll carry out an, October 7th after October 7th after October 7th until we've cleared all of Palestine from Jews, which is basically the whole state of Israel. And people, say, well, that's Hamas, but there is the PLO, Fatah in the West Bank, and they're a relatively moderate group that we can, discuss peace with, and those options, like you said, were given to them back in the day. Of course, Ehud Barak went to Camp David and offered them, 97% of the West Bank and half of Jerusalem, and everything that they could ask for. Basically, they walked away from that and started another intifada.
On the one side you have Gaza and the politically, democratically elected. Of course that term might be used questionably when it comes to anything that happens in Gaza, at the hands of Hamas. But, the people of Gaza elected Hamas, this terrorist organization, as their leadership with their stated goal to kill Jews, annihilate the state of Israel, and then move on to the rest of the West, the great Satan. So there you have that in Gaza. And then you've got what you're talking about in the Palestinian Authority and Fatah and all these other groups. There are so many of them. They don't agree. They don't get along amongst themselves. They're in a constant power struggle, who have policies like you're talking about. And then when you boil that down and condense that down to what that looks like as an Israeli and what Israelis have to do just to secure their people. On one side, you have people that are trying to break in and have committed themselves and promised to commit more acts like October 7th until Israel is no more. And on the other side, you have people with the pay-to-slay policy in place where they're paying people to slaughter Israelis. And then the world stands by and criticizes Israel for making these parties go through checkpoints so that they can determine which of them are trying to kill them on a given day. And, how
or having blockades to check the ships coming into the Gaza port to look for rockets and missiles. How dare you? This is
right.
And
how dare you try to survive? How dare you protect yourself?
Meanwhile, Egypt is just sitting there. Nobody's looking at them. Nobody cares. They can do whatever they want.
They get to play both sides.
It's hard not to look at this and just kind of lose hope. But at the end of the day, I think that creative minds can always come up with solutions. And there is an opportunity right now. We should state that because, we live in this nexus between a lot of Christians who love Israel. And by the way, I love the Palestinians as well. I've always said, as somebody who believes in the Bible, that in order to support Israel, you shouldn't hate Palestinians, or support the Palestinians, you shouldn't hate Israelis. If both are created in God's image and they have the highest inherent value on their lives, we should always look for solutions that improve the quality of life of both people on both sides of the conflict. And I think there's a lot of Christians out there that, and Jews, of course, that share these beliefs. But right now there's an opportunity because there's, I think around 1.6 million displaced people from Gaza. You've seen the flyover photos of Gaza. It's been, really many areas that have been completely destroyed. And these people will probably be in refugee-like tent cities, those who don't take up Trump's offer and move to Indonesia or somewhere else in the meantime. And they need humanitarian aid delivered to them. And there are structures now in place and being put in place to deliver humanitarian aid directly to the Palestinian people in a way that bypasses Hamas, which is exciting because it offers an opportunity for the large Christian humanitarian organizations, if it's World Vision or Convoy of Hope or Operation Blessing or these big organizations that, by the way, work in a lot of other places in the Middle East, have Arabic speaking staff. And once they get involved and could help supply some of this aid, who's going to provide education for the 600,000 or 700,000 Palestinian children in these camps? UNRWA, and now that UNRWA is no longer relevant and the Palestinian Authority in Gaza is pretty much, Hamas is being dismantled. I think it's an opportunity for the Arabic speaking staff of the large humanitarian aid organizations who are not Jewish and not Muslim and love both the Israelis and the Palestinians to offer education curriculum to these kids in these camps in Gaza. And that could hopefully begin the re-education process of a generation. How is it that we are about 80 years after the Holocaust and the most, at least throughout the last year, the most supportive country in Western Europe of Israel is Germany. It's because the Allied powers came into Germany and for 4 years after World War II basically took away their sovereignty and took over the education program, removed anti-Semitism, hatred from that curriculum, and a whole generation was raised with a different outlook on life. And so I think there is an opportunity here as the right entities get engaged to actually have those, let's say, objective players that care about Israelis and Palestinians and understand the need to re-educate the next generation.
I think it starts, what I like about Dan's approach is it kind of starts with truth. He's got a pretty scathing review of the Hamas leadership that's been taken out, as he should. And I think in order to solve a problem, you must first identify the problem in its entirety and with clarity. I think that is one of the challenges that we face in today's world with all these narratives floating around and revisionist history and so on and so forth. And I also think it's incredibly demeaning, some of these narratives, to Palestinians in general. You hear a lot of talk about, well, if you go in and take out, Hamas, that's just going to cause another cycle of violence because, the children of these Hamas leaders are going to hate you and that's actually extremely historically inaccurate and demeaning to that people. What you just said is really interesting about Germany. But it started with truth. It started with the ability to be able to look at something and say that's inherently good or that's inherently evil. Right. And in this case, that's something that it seems like that moral compass is really lacking in the world today, to be able to look at an atrocity like October 7th and say that you have to understand context, as opposed to just being able to say that was evil and we have to do away with the system that, right. Was put in place to allow that to happen. And, and then you look at historically, when you hear those types of arguments, that this is just a cycle of violence, I can certainly say that as much violence and as many wars have been imposed upon Israel over the years, they are certainly, as an Israeli, desirous of peace. We are desirous of peace. If we had a true peace partner, we would be able to put all of that behind us. And I can hug the son of a terrorist if he really wants peace, just in the same way that Japan did after World War II, that right. Germany did after World War II, that all of these countries that went in and experienced, enormous amounts of violence and civilian casualties and all these different things, that, whatever you're feeling on whether that should or shouldn't have happened, it did happen. And that's what it took at that time to win that war. And here we are, 80 years later, and we're at peace. We're at peace with Japan. We're at peace with Germany. And could that not be the case? Can we not apply that same standard to people living in Gaza and Palestinians? I think we can, and I think we should. And I think until we do, we're doing them an incredibly huge disservice, and we're not going to actually solve the problem. But, certainly, Calev, I think, as you said, there is a lot of hope. Right now, there are doors that are opening that haven't been opened ever before. And it starts with this awareness. It starts with people right. getting in and seeing what's happening, and again, identifying the truth, and then getting the right players on the field.
In our second episode, we talked to Andrew Tucker from Think. And we explored Lawfare and all sorts of good things. In this next clip, he talks about the flaws of the UN and ways that they could be addressed.
How do we bring real and meaningful change at the UN, at the ICC? Or are they just too far gone at this point? Do we just start to defund and dismantle? What is the solution to this problem, in your opinion?
Well, the first thing, I suppose, is to identify what the problem is. There is a problem. There really is. And it's a structural one. There's a problem with the sort of one state, one vote system in the UN, whereby there's always this automatic majority in the General Assembly. So I think the General Assembly is a problem, the way it functions. And it plays down into all these. So the General Assembly creates a lot of these other UN institutions. One of them is UNRWA, the refugee system. And look, I tend to think at the end of the day, the only way to address this, we've been tinkering around at the edges. You might remember the Human Rights Council was radically reformed. Was the Human Rights Commission radically reformed, replaced by the Human Rights Council? It's no better than it was. So reforming it apparently doesn't really work. I think you've just got to take some pretty radical action. And to my mind, let's take UNRWA, I think is a really good example. You have an organization which is massively funded to keep the Palestinians as perpetual refugees and allowed an educational system based on hatred of Israel and the Jewish people, infiltrated by Hamas, etc., etc. It's all been documented. We know it's the case. I don't think you can expect UNRWA to reform itself. The UN General Assembly is not going to reform it simply because of the bias within the Assembly. So it's going to come down to states like the United States, take Argentina as well, say, look, guys, we've been funding you for years. We're going to stop. And we're going to do something completely different. I don't know how it's all going to play out, but I think Trump's perhaps one of the few people who's got the ability and the courage to take this kind of action.
Okay. So pretty interesting take from somebody that's definitely in the know. And I can give you my less educated take on that, which is it's time for a new solution. At what point do you just look at this thing and say, there's no bringing this back? And I think we are beyond that point. I'm just going to say, Calev, you may or may not agree with me when it comes to the UN. The fact that I believe they just voted in someone from the regime in Iran to head up their women's rights, a place where they have police going around and arresting women for not covering their faces, is now going to head up the UN Commission on Women's Rights or whatever it is. I mean, at what point do we just look at the absolute ridiculousness of all of this and just say, this is a body that is completely compromised? And I know you have an interesting take on this, Calev, so I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
I don't know. Who is it that said that a lot of times organizations don't really do even what they think they do? In other words, the UN is because, so if do you remember, I think it was probably back, of course you remember, maybe 2009 or something like that. One of the first animated videos that we did when we were leading the Jerusalem Institute of Justice was understanding UN bias against Israel. If anybody listening, go out and Google or look in YouTube for understanding UN bias against Israel. And it tells this whole story about the coalition between the communist developing nations that came together with the unidentified Muslim nations. And they passed these resolutions in 1973 against apartheid in South Africa and, Western capitalism, and then declared that Zionism is racism, and it was this huge voting block of the non-democratic, non-liberal, non-Western regimes that basically exists till today. And the other thing is, if you speak to people who are active at the UN, what they'll tell you is, so in most democratic countries, you have new ambassadors to the UN that come in with every election cycle. So like in the United States, it's every 4 years. And, Trump was just elected. So he appointed Elise Stefanik as the new ambassador to the UN, and they're in. Now, the vast majority of the countries that control the General Assembly are dictatorial regimes, right? The democracies, I don't know if they're 15% or whatever of the UN, but most of them are undemocratic, dictatorial regimes. Because that's the nature of who they are, they can have ambassadors that are there for, Cuba's ambassador might be there for 20 years or 30 years. They're kind of these, and so you have these, kind of these innocent ambassadors that come in with goodwill from democratic nations that want to reform something in the UN, and they're stepping into a game with players that have been there for 20 or 30 years that kind of just laugh at them, because by the time they learn what those other people forgot 20 years ago, they're out and the next person's in. And so it's this closed club within this international organization that's completely controlled by these dark, dictatorial regimes. And either there has to be drastic reform, or I think, an alternative organization should be created. I think that reform is possible only if it's deep serious and leveraged by monetary support. If I'm not mistaken, the United States of America provides most of the budget of the UN. And if I was in Trump's shoes, I would say, hey, look, either this 1, 2, 3, 4 changes or no more money, period. And we'll shut down your offices in New York and get out of here. If you're going to keep this anti-Semitic agenda and these anti-Semitic organizations, we're not going to do business with you anymore. And, go find your funding somewhere else. I think the UN would probably collapse, but that could probably be the best thing that could happen. I think there's a fear of okay, if that happens, then what is the forum where countries meet around the same table to discuss peace and prevent wars and so on and so forth? But it's like the UN has become so much the opposite of that already that it would almost be better just to create a new forum with new rules and just change everything. Yeah,
that's definitely where I'm at with it, in case I didn't make that clear personally in my first statement. But
I was agreeing with you.
I agree with you. That forum needs to exist. The question is, what is it now? It certainly is not the UN. What the UN is now is not what the world needs in terms of everything you just described. The way that they function, the way they operate. Again, we're deeply engaged in what's happening in social media, and I watch these comments, and a year and a half after the atrocities of October 7th, the UN finally made a statement, honoring the women, if you would, and condemning the violence that was perpetrated towards women on October. It's a year and a half later. And I remember going out and commenting, people were like, finally, and all this different stuff. And I said, who cares? Who cares? At this point, they're so compromised that I don't care what they say anymore. I don't know if you've ever heard that expression. These are words to live by. Never take criticism from someone you wouldn't take advice from. And, when you look at what the UN is today, as far as I'm concerned, what they have to say doesn't really matter, at least for me anymore. When they say it and how they say it, it just doesn't matter to people that, like me, that share my value system. I believe it's been completely compromised, and it's like you're sitting there just waiting for them to give some type of, moral judgment or statement, and it's just never coming. We were able to facilitate the first meetings, Calev, through Arise and our Voice for Freedom initiative, being a voice for the hostages. We were able to facilitate that first meeting between families of hostages in the UN. What a disheartening outcome. Right. To sit there and just have people blow smoke. I won't finish the end of that expression. And then literally do nothing about it. They did nothing that I'm aware of on behalf of the hostages, as far as I'm concerned. So anyway, I would love to see a new idea and a new concept emerge. I think there are people that are having that conversation globally today, and it'll be interesting to see where it goes from there.
Shortly after that, we talked about the ICC and how they've also become too politicized. They're very biased. So in our next clip, we talk about the ICC issuing warrants against Western leaders.
How unprecedented is that, for instance? With all of the, if you just take a crosscut of the leaders across the Middle East and their actions and what they're doing, how unprecedented is it bringing, these cases against these Israeli leaders?
Well, look, of course, so the ICC's brought cases before. It's issued arrest warrants, obviously, because people have been, charged and brought before a court. But it's the first case of bringing accusations, let alone arrest warrants, against Western leaders. So that's the first thing to note. And a country fighting a war of self-defense in a region full of dictatorships. And how is it that Assad manages to ensconce himself in Moscow with a bank account of billions of dollars? And the ICC says it's all about, removing immunity and making sure that, war criminals are pursued. Well, they should go after the real war criminals. The problem is that, Syria is not a member of the court. Russia is not a member of the court. The United States is not a member of the court. Israel is not a member of the court. So it shouldn't be going after Israeli leaders. Palestine is not a state. And yet they've created this kind of quasi-state that's become a member of the court. So the very basis of the court's jurisdiction is highly pretentious. It's totally ludicrous. And yet they're using it to go after Israeli leaders. And that is all the influence of the Arab states on the court.
So I first of all want to personally applaud Andrew for being able to say removing immunity. I think that's an expression that, try to say removing immunity 3 times fast. Not easy to get out. So we love Andrew and think that he's doing amazing work. Calev, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on that. I mean, obviously, this is a terrible abuse of justice. It's a terrible injustice. The court does not have any authority over a country that is not a signatory to the Rome Statute, which Israel is not. Only states can be signatories to the Rome Statute. And although Palestine, quote unquote, is not a state, it signed the Rome Statute without being a state. It doesn't have a defined territory, which is the most basic requirement of a state. So there should be no jurisdiction for that reason. You can't have jurisdiction unless it's complementary, which means that it only applies to states that don't have their own separate judiciary that can hold their leaders accountable to the rule of law. Well, Israel, our prime minister is on criminal trial right now. We've already sent former prime ministers and presidents to jail for crimes. And the IDF is actively investigating and trying soldiers that may have, transgressed the Geneva Convention with one decision or another. We have a robust system of doing this. So that's another reason why the court doesn't have any jurisdiction. And then the claim of intentionally starving the Palestinians, while intentional starvation means letting 150,000 trucks in with humanitarian aid since the beginning of the war. I mean, it makes such a laughingstock of this quote unquote judicial process, and so wrong for so many reasons. But as a lawyer that's practiced international law, I want to say that I just want to if you could think back with me to 2016 when I went to the ICC and submitted a request to investigate Ismail Haniyeh, the supreme leader of Hamas at that time, for war crimes against Palestinians in Gaza, and submitted a request to the chief prosecutor with 400 pages of evidentiary documentation of them using human beings as human shields, which is a war crime under the Geneva Conventions, storing weapons in civilian infrastructure, which makes humans a target in schools and hospitals and clinics, which is a war crime, using faulty weaponry, which they'd shoot rockets, and many of them would fall on Palestinians in Gaza and kill them, which is a war crime. These aren't war crimes of Hamas against Israel. These are war crimes of Hamas against the Palestinians. And with all that evidence, it took them 3 years for them to notify us that they would begin investigating this. And, that was in 2000. So we submitted in 2016, 2019, they said, we're going to start investigating this. And until today, well, of course, Ismail Haniyeh is no longer with us. He was
Thank goodness.
Taken out by a mysterious explosion in Iran, some 6 or 7 months ago. But if he was alive, he wouldn't have even been indicted yet. Okay. How is it that in this case that has no legal basis whatsoever, it's within 6 months, not only do we have an investigation, we have an indictment, we have a arrest warrant against our prime minister. It's so, I don't know what to say except for the fact that, again, as an international lawyer who wishes that there was a system that could actually hold, these dictatorial, murderous leaders accountable. It's a shame that it actually doesn't exist, and the ICC has become something very, very different that, again, it would be better probably if it didn't even exist in today's world.
Okay, so there's a ton to unpack there, and I couldn't agree more. And I think we can all agree, but man, do I wish that they would have taken the time to really look through that report, that 400-page report that you submitted, and act on that. Because when you look at what's happened in Gaza in this latest war, it is a direct result of the things that you just mentioned in that report. You've got all of these voices around the world that are chiming up in support of the children of Gaza that are experiencing violence, with no understanding of what has led to that and the true cause behind it, which is Hamas entrenching themselves amongst civilian populations, building, a tunnel system that's longer than the underground in Great Britain underneath civilian infrastructure in Gaza. And then they actually have,
and by the way, using children to dig those tunnels because they're nimble and can fit in small spaces, as a direct quote from Hamas leaders who were very proud of that. You know what I mean? Militarization of children. But this is something that we saw 7 years before October 7, 2023, brought it to the ICC, and it just hits a wall. Nobody actually cares, if it's not about.
Yeah, they have a human casualty strategy in place. Right. They have a human casualty strategy in place that they openly admit to. And then somehow the world has the audacity and ignorance to criticize Israel without understanding at all what it's like to try to go in and uproot an army. They are an army like that. And I always try to paint pictures so people understand. Let's say that you are an operator in Gaza, an infantry tactician or whatever it may be, a unit on the ground in Gaza. And simultaneously, we know that Israel has the most cutting edge technology in the world and that they have drones that are observing the field of combat, in this case, civilian infrastructure. We have satellite imagery that we can take. And so let's say you've got, some type of imagery from the sky that can look at the field of combat. And you've got tacticians on the ground that are operating, and they identify an RPG or whatever type of munitions may be pointed out of a window in a mosque, a hospital, a high rise, whatever it would be. And somebody has to make a decision right there on what they're going to do. There's an active threat to people operating on the ground that are going in, looking for hostages, trying to take out Hamas and uproot this network of evil and terror. And you get put in situations where you have to make calls. What we know is there's a militant with ill intentions in a civilian infrastructure. We don't know who's behind it. We don't know who's inside that building. We don't know, even though we may have dropped leaflets. And you can see the picture. You have to make a decision. And of course, you're going to protect your people. You're going to protect your citizens. You're going to protect your soldiers. And you have so much ignorance out there with people just blasting Israel when we do everything that we can to avoid civilian casualties. And you're put in the most difficult and unprecedented combat scenarios on the planet. Never before in the history of mankind has there been a war like this. And I know that a lot of that information will emerge and is emerging and will continue to emerge in the future, but people just don't understand that. Zooming out for a second, because I get very charged up about all these things, but I say all that to say, I wish they would have listened and read that report and considered that and acted on that. We wouldn't be in the situation. If you really want to save the children of Gaza world, those of you that are listening and criticizing, maybe take a look at that report and let's not make the same mistake again. But zooming out for a second, this leads to a much bigger issue, which is the issue of lawfare in today's world. And we've seen it, of course, here in the United States. And, we had a very interesting conversation, Calev, you may recall, with Natasha Hausdorff, who I'd love to get on our podcast, where she sort of pointed out in a very articulate way the difference between lawfare and the rule of law. And it was extremely profound to me hearing her explain that. I wouldn't be able to do it justice. But, the difference of law being the end and justice, the law exists to serve justice, and it's immovable. It doesn't have an agenda. It just is. Whereas lawfare is the use of law to an end. It's agendizing, if you would. I don't even know if that's a word. Law and the judicial systems. And this is just another example of this use of lawfare, which is, running rampant globally right now. And it's important to understand this was planned. This was planned in advance before October 7th. They planned on doing all of this. Clev, what are your thoughts on that as a lawyer?
Well, I agree with all that. And it's using the judicial system for a very politicized, in this case, anti-Israeli agenda, but it could be for any, it could be any type of misuse. I do want to come back to the issue of what do you do about it? And I have to applaud President Trump here for responding to the ICC misuse or injustice or misuse of the justice system to put sanctions on anybody that had to do with those decisions in the court, and that would limit their ability to travel to the United States, et cetera. I think it's a great move. Like, you can't play this game, pretend to be a Western enlightened international judicial forum and just go and completely use it for political goals that have nothing to do with justice and nothing to do with the reason that you like. There has to be, at the end of the day, a penalty for that. There has to be somebody who stands up and says enough is enough, and it seems like, the current American administration is very clear on this issue. So, thank God for that.
Agendizing is a word, by the way.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
It's unthinkable, though, to imagine the agendizing, if you would, of the judicial system in the Western democratic world. It's been behind all of American politics for quite some time now, and of course globally as well.
The definition is pretty funny. Anyway, all right, let's get on to Dumasani, Washington, shall we?
Yes.
Dumasani was on for our third episode. We talked about Zionism, and more importantly, the big question is anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism. So in this first clip, he talks about anti-Semitism in politics and kind of the trend and where it's going.
The many Democrats who wound up voting for Trump were like going, I didn't leave the Democratic Party left me. Why am I saying all that? The same thing is brewing on the right. For those who understand what you just said, Simeon, that Israel is one of, if not our greatest ally, our partner in terms of freedom, democracy, all of it. It's a multi-ethnic democracy, and it works, right? Of all the things that are going on around that little tiny nation, that's all of 77 years old. You're talking about all kinds of technology from that place, all kinds of humanitarianism from that place, right? What you're seeing there, and particularly with them standing against the Islamism that's trying to destroy it in the West, right? For those who are the America First, who are seeing the Jew hatred, the blatant Jew, the Stu Peters, right? The platforming, like I said, the Tucker Carlson. We're not going to talk about Christian anti-Semitism, or we're going to talk about persecution, but we are going to go to a pastor in Bethlehem, which is part of the Palestinian Authority, so he can dump on Israel for 2 hours, right? So those who see that, they have to have the moral courage to call it out. What our concern is, you all, is not that we see it as huge. We don't. We still see it as a small part. The reason why we believe it's growing is because there's too much moral cowardice, because people don't want to call out these people. The same way they didn't want to call out Ilhan Omar because of all of the what she represented to the progressive left. They don't want to call out the Candaces. They don't want to call out the Tucker Carlsons for the same reason. We see the same moral cowardice on the right. And as we said before, anti-Semitism, among other things, destroyed the Democratic Party. It will destroy the Republican Party. And I've had my spiritual, Pastor Dumasani, you can't say that. And then they start waving the Israeli and the American flag and quote scriptures. I said, dude, I know the scriptures. I get what the flag is. I'm talking about how this actually works in the real world. You don't get to wave a flag away at the anti-Semitism in your party and act like it's not there. You're going to have to call it out. And until we see that, we should all be concerned. Until, I'm not going to even name the people, but these people with these big podcasts and these big platforms on the right, until they get up on their podcast and call out by name the people who are coming for the Jews, who are using these Qatari talking points, until that happens, again, we should all be concerned.
First of all, I just want to say I love Dumasani. And 13 years ago, when I was in his home out there in Compton, with, I don't know if it's 6 or 8 children. He has a really big family, and they all got in their living room and sang. First of all, the guy, beyond being extremely articulate and a really clear and wonderful leader, he is an amazing musician and vocalist. I mean, if you ever have a chance to hear Dumasani sing, it'll send chills down your back. And he's such a wonderful person. There's so much he said there that's correct. And I love that he challenges, the kind of let's say Christian nationalists that, like Tucker Carlson, that'll put a pastor from Bethlehem on air for 2 hours that doesn't talk about the fact that the Palestinian Authority has been abusing their rights for years. We're talking about forced expropriation of property, where they just take people's homes away from Christians and give them to Muslims, and arrest Christians for the terrible crime of selling a piece of land to a Jew, or or God forbid, preaching the gospel in the Palestinian Authority, right? So the pastor doesn't mention any of that, as if there's no persecution of Christians in his own backyard from his own administration. Puts all the blame on Israel for all the suffering of the Palestinians. And so Tucker Carlson airs this for 2 hours and completely ignores, like Dumisani said, I loved it when he talked about the millions of Christians being slaughtered in Africa, which is a horrific situation. I think he said 4 million Christians were slaughtered just in the last year in Nigeria or something like that by Islamists. Crazy. And these same people never mention that. And so, one of the best definitions of anti-Semitism is just like a completely different standard that you apply to Jews or the Jewish state than you would to any other people. And I think that's where you see the true colors of people like Tucker Carlson coming through. And I'm glad they're a small minority, but I think he's right. I think it needs to be addressed.
Couldn't agree more. And it was a pointed question that I asked him, which is anti-Zionism anti-Semitism? And as far as I'm concerned, it absolutely is, for the reasons that you just stated, Calev. There's nobody out marching in the streets against Putin, a dictator, right, no matter your perspective on him, or any other dictatorial leader across the world. And yet there are these people, speaking of which, we could go into the hot topic of the Douglas Murray, Joe Rogan podcast, if you would. Great example. Why is this even such a big issue? Why are the biggest platforms in the world so hyper focused on Israel, the only liberal democracy in the Middle East? There isn't another one. The only place that I'm aware of in the Middle East, Calev, that someone could be openly homosexual or can openly practice Christianity. Women have freedom. Women serve in our parliament. I believe a third of all of the members of Knesset, at least a third or over a third of all the members of Knesset are women in Israel. And so many, I could go on and on and on and on about what an amazing and free, truly free country the state of Israel is. It's not without problems, just like any other country on the planet. Okay. And then such a focus in the world lens, through the world lens, on this little tiny place the size of New Jersey on a map. And if you think that that isn't fueled by anti-Semitism, then you are sadly mistaken. And one might say, oh, well, even the Jews are critical. So what? So what?
When I was thinking about this whole conversation between Dave and Douglas, it appears to me that Dave is, he calls himself a libertarian, but between the lines, it kind of sounds like he's also a pacifist. He's basically an anti-war guy because he's basically saying Israel should have done everything except to actually go and he even called the war that's being executed in Gaza murder. Like in any court of law, this would be called murder, which is obviously inaccurate from a legal perspective. So he's an anti-war guy. Okay, now, where is the only place on earth that actually has a violent dispute today that you have freedom of press, where journalists can go in, take pictures, interview people on the ground? You don't have that in many of these African countries where journalists are just summarily killed. And so it's because of our freedom of expression and freedom of journalism and everything else that this story actually goes out. And then that's the story that somebody like Dave can talk about, because he wants to talk against war in general, as if there is no circumstance in which, killing a human being could be justified on this earth. And I actually think that it speaks to the strength of Israel that we are a Western democracy with freedom of expression, freedom of press. We let journalists in, we let them take pictures, we let them tell the story, and it's to our detriment because it just fuels discussions like this and becomes the epic issue for these quote unquote experts to get into a studio. It was kind of a shame that Douglas got pulled into that whole kind of side issue of how could you talk about a situation that you've never been to the region, you've never visited Israel, you've never come to one of these checkpoints, because that became a whole conversation in and of itself. But I understand his feelings about that, because he's a journalist of high integrity, and he doesn't really talk or write about places that he hasn't gone and visited himself. And I think there's something right about that perspective.
I think he was politely and diplomatically pointing out the fact, look, everyone has the right to talk about whatever they want. But what he's pointing out that is so right and true is that there are people that are unquestionably not experts on a topic that are building massive followings and massive platforms on this single issue, and the hypocrisy. He doesn't use those words. We have the liberty to say whatever we want right here. But the blatant hypocrisy of all of that, and then to just sit there and listen to somebody that's, somewhat proudly, maybe not proudly, but openly stating that they're a Jew, but then they rattle off the actual talking points, all of those that are in opposition to Israel and the state of Israel and this conflict, honestly, it's just disgusting for me to see such ignorant comments comparing and saying that there were a lot of similarities between Gaza before October 7th and concentration camps. I cannot tell you how hard it was for me to sit there and listen to such an absolutely ignorant perspective on this subject. And I think, again, Douglas was being polite in the way that he addressed that. It is kind of a shame that became the big issue, was the qualifications of these people to even talk on the subject. You've got Dave citing 30-year-old research that came out for 1 year in 1996 about the economic impact of the blockade in 1996. And he keeps going back to it. It's like, man, could you get some new data? Do you actually have any idea what happens on the ground between 1996 and today? How much aid has gone into this tiny strip on the map? Calev, we've talked before about the Marshall Plan and how much more money than the Marshall Plan, which was the plan to rebuild all of Europe after World War II, how much more you can
I'll tell you how much more.
If you
look at all the aid that's gone from the international community into the Palestinian Authority between 1994, which was signing of the Oslo Accords, until 2024, between 15 to 20 times more aid has been given to the Palestinians than was given from the United States to Europe under the Marshall Plan after World War II for the complete reconstruction of the European economy. And the Palestinians have zero to show for it. Where did all that money disappear to? Of course, there is the pay-to-slay policy, which a lot of it was used to pay people in order to kill Israelis, but the rest of it was deposited into the private bank accounts of very corrupt leaders. How is it that all of the top echelon of Hamas are billionaires? Khaled Mashal, Ismail Haniyeh. Where did all this money come from? It's from the tax dollars of United States citizens and European countries, with goodwill that just donated to this purpose. More money has been donated to the Palestinian cause than any humanitarian issue per capita, than any humanitarian issue in the history of mankind, only to create these billionaire terrorists that then go and,
and a pretty robust tunnel system.
Of course, right. But in order to carry out atrocities like October 7th and bring death and destruction upon their own people.
It's just, to me, it's I could see why Douglas just sort of doubled down on his perspective, because, here you've got, if you zoom out and just look at, obviously in the moment it's easy for these guys to say, well, do you have to be an expert to talk about this? I could talk about whatever. Yeah, of course you can. But you're rattling off talking points about something that you don't know anything about. His points were Gaza was a concentration camp before October 7th. Completely false. Okay. I'm a Jew. I can talk about this. I have kids. Don't you love kids? I mean, come on. It's a disproportionate war. Literally, he could have read these off, a demonstration on a college campus. Oh, it's a disproportionate war, so they have no choice but to hide amongst civilian infrastructure. I mean, honestly, could you be more stupid? How many billions of dollars and years did it take to build that tunnel system under Gaza? Oh, but and guess what? Guess who's not allowed in the tunnels?
Civilians.
Guess who's not allowed to hide out in the tunnels? Dave.
Children.
The kids, the civilians.
Right.
Are you this stupid? It's mind-boggling to me.
I would also say shame on Joe Rogan. I think what happened here is that Douglas Murray came out with a new book, and Joe Rogan wanted to interview him, and he didn't feel necessarily comfortable with all the propositions of Douglas in that book. So he wanted to bring an opposing voice to kind of talk about these issues. Apparently, he couldn't find any real expert that could challenge Douglas's points in his book because it's such a well-written, well-researched book. So he brought in somebody that has an opposing view, but he's a joke. Like he's literally a
joker.
but he has no idea what he's talking about. And I think it actually ended up discrediting Joe Rogan and his show because it's not a serious conversation between two serious intellectuals.
I could see how Douglas got caught up in that because he was very politely sort of saying what I would not have been able to hold it together as I'm watching a comedian rattle off talking points.
Nonsense.
Literally that have no basis in reality truth, and having never seen the location, having never been in a theater of war, and this guy is somehow hailed as an expert because he clearly has some level of high IQ and he's a good debater and he can argue with you. And, the tragedy in all of it to me, to some degree, is that a lot of people will walk away from that. And because of the size, you've got probably the number one podcast on the planet. Some of these guys are the biggest podcasters on the planet. And you've got, a very articulate expert that's dressed well telling them why they don't have a right to talk about it. And he was being very, very polite, very, very generous with them in that. But a lot of people are going to walk away from that on the side of Joe Rogan, which is extremely unfortunately because they relate to it. I'm a working class and I can talk about it. Not that Joe Rogan is working class, but you understand what I'm saying. He talks just the way we talk. He's not a politician. He's not these guys. I relate to a comedian more than I relate to an expert. And I get it, but it's actually a real shame in a lot of ways. But anyway, we could go on and on all day about that.
I actually think it's a pretty good caveat into the last clip I have from Dumasani. He talks about sort of what's going on college campuses. And, you could kind of see how your average Joe gets caught up in this, and they get all these, they get all this information and all these facts from, Al Jazeera and all these, biased agencies, and they cling to them and they think they're experts when they really have no idea. So let me play this for you.
I tell people all the time, what often happens in this discussion where the Black community is concerned is because of our high profileness, if you will. The anti-Zionism within the Black community often gets more of the focus because of maybe the charismatic nature of those leaders, the number of followers that they have. But often what gets missed is this. They are still those leaders who drink from the anti-Zionism well are being used as props to present anti-Zionism as a social justice movement. Because I often say this, where is Jew hatred most on fire in the United States? College campuses, not the Black ones, the white ones, not at Howard, at Harvard, at Princeton, at Boston University. This is what's happening. What's my point? I'm not making it racialized. I'm saying this. What happened over the decades was hating Israel became a badge of honor for those who believe in justice and equality and yada, yada. That was the whole plot of the PLO. So the main people who are touting the Palestinian flags and burning the Israeli flags are usually white kids on campuses who've actually drunk the Kool-Aid, right? So this is what's actually going on.
Yeah, I love it. And he's so clear and so animated. He's such a great thinker. Dumisani. I think it's not by accident that the anti-Israeli protests are taking place on the predominantly white Ivy League schools, because we know that, over the last decade, Qatar has given over $6.5 billion of grants to these universities and Middle East departments and student clubs. By the way, it's coming out now that apparently more than that has been given to K through 12 pre-college education systems, and they go into these classrooms in Texas and in New York that have world, on the world map, instead of Israel, it says Palestine. And, this is a very dangerous state-funded propaganda machine that has turned the academic institutions and their students against Israel. I'll just tell a little story regarding Qatar, as seeing this and seeing how they've funded much of the anti-Israeli propaganda that we've seen, of course, through Al Jazeera, but through the education system in the United States, and through, them paying Russia to manipulate the algorithms in TikTok and social media, etc. Before these last elections, before the Republican convention of these last elections, I have a friend. He's not on the committee that drafts the platform of the Republican Party, but he's a consultant for them. And I contacted him and said, hey, is there something you could put in there regarding the Qatari funding of propaganda in universities is actually part of the Republican platform to stand against this gross breach of, American sovereignty. And he said, it's really funny that you contacted me, because I was already offered $20 million by the Qataris to put in, a different language. I said, what? Like, again, he's not even on the committee that makes these decisions. He's just an independent consultant for them. Yeah. He said first they came and offered $5 million. And I said, no, I'm not interested. And then they offered 10, no, I'm not interested. And they went all the way up to 20 million. And I said, you don't understand, my voice cannot be purchased like this. But this is the deal. Like they have people on their payroll. This isn't some kind of crazy conspiracy. They don't even deny it. Like, it's just out there in the open. Qatar is a bank with a flag, like Dan Diker said, and an Islamic agenda that, has an extreme Islamist agenda, but at the same time is, best friends with the West because they're sitting on tons of money and love to pay off politicians and universities and academic systems. I love it that Dumisani Washington mentioned Qatar several times throughout the interview and talked about where this is happening, and I think it's also not a surprise to me that it would be kind of the white kind of upper class, Ivy League kids that buy into this nonsense, because they don't have any system of actually understanding the real pain on the street and the needs of social justice, like the Black community has. It's not going to buy into all these stupid conspiracy theories that are like disconnected from reality.
Yeah, absolutely. And, and then your friend who turned down the 5 million, then turned down the 10, and then turned down the 20 million. How many people have the courage and fortitude and backbone to do that?
You have to have a strong ideological backbone to say no.
And then you scratch your head and you look at some, without pointing specifics at without pointing fingers at specific public figures, but we've mentioned a few today, and you wonder, boy, this seems like a shift from this person that was a conservative that was speaking here or there. And you wonder, wonder if they might have received some of those same offers, but didn't have the courage and fortitude to stand up for what's right. Makes you kind of scratch your head, doesn't it? As we're winding down this episode, just to put a little bow on it, if we don't come together, people that share our value system, Judeo-Christian values, people that value life as we know it here in the West, Western civilization, democracy and freedom, if we don't come together, we're in trouble. If wokeism, communism, and Islamism can come together and wage war against everything that we believe in, and successfully, by the way, we had better unite and get our game together. We are up against an opposition that is more resourced than we are. Talking about Qatar, able to write checks for $5, $10, and $20 million that could change the lives, drastically of people that are writing, papers that we'll never even read. Just imagine that for a minute and think of, for our small nonprofit, how hard it is to raise funds for the very important work that we're doing. So we're up against an enemy that is by far better resourced than we are, by far more organized than we are. They're waging war on our very way of life, and most people that share our way of life don't even know it, let alone engage in the war. They're more organized than we are, and they're more motivated than we are. And we've got to wake up and go to work.
I think that's very well said. What is our way of life? We are very privileged and thankful to have grown up in Western democracies that are based on the Judeo-Christian foundations of Western civilization. And all the entities that we talked about today, whether it's Qatar with all their money, whether it's the ICC, the General Assembly of the UN that have bought into these, it's more than just an anti-Israel narrative. There is a concerted state-backed effort to destroy the Judeo-Christian foundations of Western society. That's what we're facing. Israel is the canary in the mine shaft, to borrow an overused cliche, but it's absolutely true. And so we have to close ranks, and we have to work together to push this back. And that's why in Arise, like you said, we've created the Turning the Tide project, which is to say, okay, how do we create a groundswell of influence in the opposite direction to make sure that the next generation can grow up and live and enjoy prosperity in Western democracies that are based on the Judeo-Christian foundations and Western civilization. We can't lose this, friends, and we're going to need to fight and fight hard in order to preserve it.
Yeah, and if you're interested in knowing more about what we do, please do go check out our website, ariseforisrael.com. One word, Arise for Israel, no letters or no numbers, Arise for Israel, all letters. And also, learn how you can get involved in this battle. It's on your doorstep, whether you like it or not, and whether you know it or not. So please do get in touch with us, reach out to us through our website. We'd be happy to hear from you and go to work together on this. Thanks for tuning in, and we look forward to being in touch with you through our next episode.
Thanks, everybody.